Why is it that we're seeing this kind of conduct, this kind of violence that we're used to seeing in the third world conducted in the UK by students? This type of protest with this type of demonstration seems like it would be more in place perhaps in Iran or former Eastern European countries under the communists. What we've had here is we have a dynamic that's happening, there's a bigger dynamic happening with conservative governments throughout Europe. A few years ago, what we had is a collapse of the banking structure. That is the reality of our age. The banks collapsed, and as any government would do, the governments of the West stepped in to bail the banks out so that cash station machines would run that next Monday morning. This resulted, along with the recession, in a transfer amount of borrowing moving from the banking sector and the private sector into the public sector, trying to keep the economy afloat. And basically, every industrialized country did this to some extent. The West already was burdened with significant debt, particularly the United States. The UK had a huge financial sector, and so the bailout had to be fairly considerable. This was the reality, but politics always flows from reality to the fantasy world that political parties try to use to influence their viewers. The fantasy is very often what drives policy, but policy in itself has realistic implications, which will often turn that fantasy into nightmare or into an experience of sudden awakening. Okay? What we've seen with the Cameron government in the United Kingdom is that the entire issue with the banks, that the banks were not being regulated, that they were investing risky, all this stuff was washed away easily because it would have had to, the English speaking world would have had to admit that 20 years of lecturing the third world and countries like Germany about how they were supposed to run their economy was empty bullshit. That the nations that follow the Western example of deregulation and allowing consumer debt, deregulating their banks like Ireland, the countries that have property booms like Spain, the United States, the UK, are suffering for this right now. And this would have harmed the core nationalism, which is really a fantasy position. The nations exist in imagination. People see their in a multicultural civilization, their identities are exist in the fantasy world, in the imaginative world. Identity takes place in the imaginative world. People construct their world beliefs in this type of imagination. Political leaders pander to this imagination. What we've seen in David Cameron is very shortly, he completely changed his philosophical view, exploit an opportunity when this happened, and saw that the whole guilt and issues that could have been entailed with facing up to the banking collapse could be resolved simply by saying that this was government spending, because the fantasy that's held by a large percentage of the middle class in the English-speaking world is that the receivers of government benefits are these loafers, these freeloaders having huge families, not doing any work, and that the government's running up huge debts for this. You hear this repeatedly over and over. Foreigners coming into the country receiving huge amounts of expenditure. So it was enough of a fantasy that he was able to pull in enough votes to form a coalition for the government. Then what he did is executed this policy across these fantasy positions. But there, in such a case, you have to decide who is going to make the cuts. Normally, what happens in conservative governments is that the people who cut are people who are otherized or alienated from the mainstream society and can take these cuts without the greater culture feeling as though it's damaged because they're outsiders. For example, in the United States, programs are often cut that impact African Americans. And my expectation would have been that a kind of cynical but sensible Cameron government would have sought to make cuts that would have impacted people who are already long-term unemployed, long-term impoverished. What's probably happened, those people have already been cut to the bone. A very strange decision was made, and not necessarily an entire practical one, that a huge part of the moral repaying of the debt would be laid on Britain's future university students. This was predicated under a fact that these young people who didn't understand what life was really like, who'd had it too easy, who had benefited under too much boom, were now going to be made to pay the price. And it probably fit within a large area of the Tory imagination about how liberty and government systems work. The thing is that it suddenly became, for the majority of people thinking about university in Britain, £40,000 of debt that they'd be walking out of university with. This is a reality figure. I mean, whatever you want to particularly believe, I probably could get you to believe something else for £40,000. £40,000 is more debt than anyone can hold any imaginative fantasy for. And in the student population, the student protests, and in the violence that we saw reacting, the actual reality of the fact that these people are facing a generation of crippling death that is being targeted upon them. They are being identified. They are being targeted. The older population has a higher voting rate. Older people tend more likely to be Tories. They're unlikely to see very much in the way of cuts. But these university students, these children of the baby boomers, they're facing a huge debt forward. This fantasy thus resulted into a reality, this particular debt, which is clearly in the process of radicalizing the middle class student group. And wherever you've seen revolutionary movements happening in before, it is this university student group that once it's radicalized, that's the key ingredient of a revolutionary movement. I'm not saying that there's going to be a revolution in the UK. I'm almost certain there isn't going to be. But I think what we saw at the Tory headquarters is the beginning. Now, we see the response of fantasy in it, that this was a group of hooligans to move it into the judicial system, the criminal justice system. Courts are the ultimate places for reinforcing fantasies. Juries allow their prejudices and their own preconceived imaginary ideals of the world. Judges, laws simply reinforce this. But it's inescapable that there is the real impact of £40,000 of debt upon a young person's life. This isn't just part of a club of fantasy parameters that a conservative tells themselves. This is a reality. This is something that goes beyond the imaginary life that so many of our people view the world through. And this reality, I can see, drives. I really have a hard time seeing how the kind of illusion that, oh, all of this problem was because of government spending, not the banks, not problems with capitalism, not problems with regulation, not problems with the earlier generations boom and bust, not problems with but problems of government spending, and that these students, each one of them needs to take upon themselves a debt of £40,000. The fantasy completely breaks away. The students wake up out of the fantasy and are driven to radical action. And I think we're going to see quite a bit more of this. I think it was also marked how impotent the police response was. Was that simply because they were understaffed or they weren't prepared? Or is this because with justice cuts, they're actually in the same boat? How large could this extend? Would these student protests, will they be joined? I mean, certainly they'll be joined by Transport for London workers. A huge percentage of the British population works for the public sector. They're facing the same situation. Are we seeing the beginning here of a movement like we saw at the poll tax that could very quickly bring this government down in the way Thatcher was brought down?